Red has been a known name in the film industry since the 2000s, making cinema-grade camera equipment. After about 10 years of making cinema equipment, they decided to try making a phone, and after about a year of known development, they released the Red Hydrogen 1, which was a highly anticipated device. Although when reviewers got the phone, they were quick to note that the phone was honestly subpar, and when it released at a price of nearly $1,300, this was one of the most expensive consumer phones to release in 2017. I'm going to go over why this phone failed and if it really is any good. This phone's main highlighted feature was its camera, as Red is a camera company, and while reviewers were using this phone, they noted underwhelming camera performance. I have a Red Hydrogen 1 here, and I also have an iPhone XS released in the same year as the Hydrogen 1, so I'm going to see which one takes better photos, a dedicated camera phone or an iPhone. So in general, photos on the Red look worse than the iPhone. This is without any edits and without going any deeper into the photo. The photo doesn't look particularly bad, but it does not look like it came from a high-end phone. But what's important to note here is that this phone's color profile resembles something closer to a cinema camera than a high-end phone. Phones are typically designed around having color profiles that people want to see in basic terms, but the case with the Hydrogen 1, along with other professional camera equipment, is that it has a very accurate color profile. I still wouldn't call it amazing, as I think that modern iPhones can have a better color profile than the Hydrogen 1. It doesn't really closely resemble a cinema camera in reality, so the camera alone didn't make this phone worth the price for most consumer buyers. What's interesting to note, though, is that even professionals said that this phone had a somewhat disappointing camera. As for the other highlighted feature of this phone, at 5.7 inches, comparable to an iPhone X's display, one of the headlining features was the 3D screen. This phone's display had a feature similar to the Nintendo 3DS where it would actually display objects in a way that resembled 3D. This feature is hard to document on camera, but I'm going to say this in the easiest way possible. It's a useless feature that was never implemented properly, and it was fun for a day when I got the phone, but then it remained boring for the rest of the time that I used this phone. One cool feature was that this phone could take 3D photos, and while some of the photos actually look pretty interesting, it's only cool to see on other Red Hydrogen users' phones, since the photo obviously can't translate to a normal display. This technology didn't work out, and nobody really said that this was the future. Red kinda tried to say that this was going to be somewhat futuristic and it was coming to other devices, but it never came to anything else except for this phone. As for the design, this is hands down one of the largest phones that I've owned. Simply due to its massive form factor, the bezels hold the speakers in the front camera and other necessary hardware, making the screen size really small for what it is, but the aluminum housing feels extremely high quality. This phone has what I can only describe as grip bars on each side, and while these all make the phone really cool, the phone actually feels less comfortable than almost any other phone that I own. It's truly surprising how much Red focused on the design on this phone, and I think that they did an absolutely outstanding job on this phone's general design. There was even a titanium model that came out later in the phone's launch cycle, but this aluminum model looks great while feeling pretty unfinished overall. There are also these two carbon fiber panels on the top and bottom of this phone, although they look like these are just vinyl pieces and not actual carbon fiber. There's a massive red logo embedded in the back of this phone, and it really does make it clear that this is more than just a basic smartphone, and it's a piece of cinema production hardware from Red. This phone promised additional camera modules using the pogo pins on the back. Unfortunately, these never came to the market. This was one of the reasons many people purchased this phone back in 2018, and unfortunately, these accessories never came out. This concept was amazing though. Imagine this phone took off and it actually got traction. Red could sell modern camera modules for this phone in 2024. The possibilities that Red came up with were really endless, but they never took this feature into reality. This phone has good specs. It has 6 GB of RAM, Snapdragon 835 processor, and a 4500 mAh battery. This phone performed pretty well, and it still holds up relatively well for basic usage, and the specs were on par with a lot of other devices. The processor was a little older than it should have been though, as the Snapdragon 845 was already established at that point, and for $1,300 at a base price, that's just really not acceptable. It should have been the latest and greatest processor. It could have had 8 GB of RAM easily, as I think that Samsung had devices with 12 GB of RAM back then. So the specs on this phone, on paper, don't sound bad, but comparing them to the price point, That's where the specs start to look really bad, and that's where the value proposition is really lost with this phone. My question here is, did this phone really ever have a chance? The answer that I've came up with is that this phone had a lot of potential when it came out. It was a phone from a big and reputable company, and it was made with good materials at that. This phone feels like it was designed in 2017 though, but when phones were evolving so fast in this era, a phone that was a year out of date was less than ideal. Pairing that with a $1,300 price tag, which was $300 more than the base flagship iPhone, this phone had no reason to have subpar specs or a subpar, kind of bad camera for the time. Red could have made a second version of this phone, but they really didn't have a reason to. Red is a cinema company first and foremost, and they likely make a lot more money off of selling their professional equipment compared to smartphones, so it makes sense as to why they discontinued their only phone a little bit less than a year after it came out. In late 2019, it was announced that Red was not going to make a follow up to this phone. And honestly, was anybody really surprised about that? This phone did not sell very well. I'm surprised I was able to get my hands on this model that I have here. But another issue that I actually have had, the model that I have is locked to AT&T. I'm unable to get that unlocked. I don't know why, but AT&T refuses to unlock the phone. It's little things like that that just wouldn't happen on an iPhone or a Samsung or even a Pixel that really made this phone feel like it was in a whole different category compared to the big three, Apple, Google, and Samsung. I'll also mention that this was a time where LG, OnePlus, and a lot of other brands like Motorola were still pretty competitive in the market. Although this was around the time that LG was getting out of the phone business, the LG phones were still selling pretty well, and it was not uncommon to go outside and see LG phones. I've never seen one person daily use a red hydrogen one. Not in my life. And I don't think that I ever will, seeing as this phone is already pretty much considered obsolete, because another issue with this phone, it didn't get Android 9. Every red hydrogen one is stuck on Android 8. And it's a little bit of an unfair comparison, but that's like buying an iPhone 15 Pro and not getting the iOS 18 update when it comes out. It's really annoying to see, because Android 9 was a major update, but other than that, Red entirely failed to support their own product. For $1,300, I know I keep on mentioning the price tag, but it's important to note that this phone was $1,300, and that was in 2018. It should not have had these support issues. It shouldn't have had any of the issues that it had. This should have been the best phone on the market because it was one of the most expensive. But it still managed to get beat out by things like the iPhone XR, the Pixel 3, Galaxy S9, and later S10. And that really is why the red hydrogen one failed. Hopefully this video was enjoyable. I also have a video on other failed phones on my channel. If you guys want to check that out, that would be appreciated. But that's the story behind the red hydrogen one. It was a phone that I wish saw success, as it had a good plan, but it was already designed really well, and some of the features just weren't executed properly, and the pricing was just too high for what the phone was. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.